Insanity and Other Disorders Affecting the Mind. James Pritchard. Preface. Although the subject of mental derangement is one to which for more than 20 years I have been led to devote much study and reflection, I should probably never have, have undertaken the work now laid before the public if I had not been requested to contribute to the Encyclopedia of Practical Medicine. While employed in preparing for that compilation, an article on insanity and some others more or less connected with it, I became more fully convinced that I had before been that out of many excellent treatises exist on various matters connected with mental derangement in the English, French, and German languages, there is yet not one work extant in either of them which exhibits the present state of knowledge and opinion on the whole subject of diseases affecting the mind. To supply this want was found not to be within the limits which propriety seemed to mark out for an article in the encyclopedia, but having become fully interested in the undertaking, I felt desirous, after the publication of my papers in that work, of finishing what I had begun and of drawing up, in a deliberate manner and with unconfined space, a more complete treatise on the same subject. In this design, I was greatly encouraged by the spontaneous and kind advice of some of my friends, and particularly by that of Dr. Tweedy, one of the editors of the Encyclopedia. The task was further recommended to me by the opportunity which it offered of stating in a more convincing manner my opinions on some important questions connected with the nature of insanity, with respect to which I believe the notions generally prevalent and sanctioned by the highest medical and legal authorities in this country to be not only erroneous but the sources of great practical evils. On this subject I have no need to explain myself at present more fully than by referring my readers to the first and second sections of the second chapter and to the third and following sections of the 11th chapter in the following treatise. A treatise on insanity and other disorders of the mind. Introduction. Preliminary remarks on the definition of insanity, nosography of the disease, its different forms. Writers on disorders of the mind have frequently remarked that it is difficult to furnish a definition of insanity which might enable us at once to recognize it when it exists and to distinguish it from all other conditions, whether of health or of disease. So great indeed has this difficulty appeared to some authors that by them it has been thought better to lay aside such an attempt. It is, however, requisite at the commencement of a treatise on any subject of extensive relations that the writer should make known to his readers in as clear and definite a manner as possible what is the precise nature of the objects to which their attention is to be directed. On this consideration, I find it to be incumbent upon me to take some notice of the attempts which have been made to define or characterize insanity, and if these attempts should be found on examination unsuccessful, to supply the defect, if not by a new definition, at least by some brief description that might answer the same purpose. It has been said with perfect accuracy that insanity is a disorder of the system by which the sound and healthy exercise of the mental faculties is impeded or disturbed. The definitions adopted by several modern writers have nearly this meaning, though expressed in various terms. Yet this statement cannot be considered as a sufficient definition of insanity, for while it probably comprises every form of that disorder, it includes also many other morbid affections. Among the latter might be mentioned the varieties of delirium which occur in phrenitis, typhus, and other febrile and inflammatory diseases, and which ought not to be confounded with insanity. Thus they are comprehended within the definition above proposed. On this account, it becomes necessary to introduce some express limitations. For a similar reason, it appears requisite to exclude the disordered state of the mental faculties, consisting chiefly in stupor and diminished capability of sensation and perception, which accompanies lethargy, apoplexy, and other comatose diseases. There are some other morbid conditions of the brain and of the faculties dependent for their exercise on the functions of that organ, which must in like manner be excluded by particular restrictions. Such are congenital idiotism and the mental weakness of old age. Now it is obvious that a definition loses all its utility when it is found necessary to encumber it with so many additional circumstances. Thus, the endeavor to define insanity in the most simple and obvious terms which suggest themselves is found to afford no satisfactory result, and a like disappointment has ensued on every similar attempt. It appears that the practical advantages of a definition can, in this instance, only be attained by stating what are in reality those disturbances which the mental operations sustain in cases of insanity. These disturbances, however, present very different phenomena and different forms of the disease, and we cannot attempt to enumerate them or describe them in a collective statement till we have taken notice of their principal varieties. It has generally been supposed that the chief, if not the sole, disorder of persons laboring under insanity consists in some particular false conviction or in some erroneous notion indelibly impressed upon the belief. Mr. Locke made a remark which has often been cited that madmen do not appear to have lost the faculty of reasoning, but having joined together some ideas very wrongly, they mistake them for truths and they err, as men do that argue right from wrong principles. From Mr. Locke's time, it has been customary to observe that insane persons reason correctly from erroneous premises, and some instance of illusion or some particular erroneous impression has been looked for as the characteristic of the disease or an essential circumstance in it. Dr. Cullen seems to have had Mr. Locke's observation in his mind when he laid down the definition of insanity which occurs in his first lines. He described this disease to be, in a person awake, a false or mistaken judgment of those relations of things which, as occurring most frequently in life, are those about which the generality of men form the same judgment, and particularly when the judgment is very different from what the person himself had before usually formed. Cullen attempted to draw even this description within narrower limits by observing that there is generally some false perception of external objects, and that such false perception necessarily occasions a delirium or erroneous judgment, which is to be considered as the disease. That this is by far too limited an account of insanity and only comprises one among various forms of mental derangement, every person must be aware who has had opportunities of extensive observation. An attentive consideration of the phenomena which present themselves in different cases of insanity enables us to observe several forms of varieties which are distinguishable from each other by well marked lines. To one division of cases, namely, to those which are referable to the form of madness termed melancholia, monomania, or partial insanity, The preceding remarks of Mr. Locke and Dr. Cullen are alone applicable. These are instances in which the illusion of the understanding is connected with some particular subject and leaves the judgment comparatively clear in other respects. The phenomena of such cases are very different from those of mania or raving madness, in which the mind is totally deranged, and the individual affected talks nonsense, or expresses himself wildly and absurdly on every subject. There is, in the third place, a class of persons generally reckoned among lunatics, but consists chiefly, if not entirely, of individuals whose disorder has already reached an advanced or protracted stage. In these, the condition of the faculties is such as to preclude the possibility of any mental effort or voluntary direction of thought. The most striking characteristics in this state are the rapid succession of ideas and the unconnected manner in which they enter into the mind without order or coherence, or at least without following their ordinary and natural arrangement and association. Incoherence is the characteristic of this morbid condition. The modifications of insanity already mentioned are affections of the understanding or rational powers, but there is likewise a form of mental derangement in which the intellectual faculties appear to have sustained little or no injury, while the disorder is manifested principally or alone in the state of the feelings, temper, or habits. In cases of this description, the moral and active principles of the mind are strangely perverted and depraved. The power of self government is lost or greatly impaired, and the individual is found to be incapable not of talking or reasoning upon any subject proposed to him. For this he will often do with great shrewdness and volubility, but of conducting himself with decency and propriety in the business of life. His wishes and inclinations, his attachments, his likings and dislikings have all undergone a morbid change, and this change appears to be the originating cause or to lie at the foundation of any disturbance which the understanding itself might seem to have sustained, and even in some instances to form throughout the sole manifestation of the disease. The older nosologists, Salvages, Sagar, and Linnaeus, were not wholly unaware of these distinctions, for in their distributions of mental disorders we find besides an order of Visanier or hallucinationes, in which erroneous impressions were supposed to affect the understanding, another department styled morositates or morbi pathetici, consisting of depraved appetites and other morbid changes in the feelings and propensities. The disordered states, however, which are classed under these heads, are not, all of them at least, strictly forms of insanity. And Pinel appears to have been the first writer who, with a clear conception of the subject, distinguished a class of mental disorders under the term of madness without delirium. Pinel, who was an acute and original observer and whose opinions carry much weight on account of his extensive opportunities of investigating the history of madness, has made the following remark in reference to the sentiments of Mr. Locke. We may justly admire, he says, the writings of this philosopher without admitting his authority upon subjects not necessarily connected with his inquiries. On resuming at Bicester my researches into this disorder, I thought, with the above author, that it was inseparable from delirium or delusion, and I was not a little surprised to find many maniacs who at no period gave evidence of any lesion of the understanding, but who were under the dominion of instinctive and abstract fury, as if the active faculties alone had sustained injury. The examples given by Pinel and in illustration of this remark were not fortunately chosen, and they are all of one kind, namely of that in which the principal manifestations of insanity were violent fits of anger or rage. The general observation which the author has so clearly expressed, that insanity consists in certain cases in a morbid perversion of the affections and moral feelings exclusively and without any perceptible lesion of the intellectual faculties, is a fact of the highest importance, pathologically and practically, and the opinion of the author above cited in this particular deserves the most attentive consideration. In the following pages, I hope to confirm this opinion and to show that the facts which I shall adduce are sufficient to authorize a more general statement than the particular instances hitherto related would lead us to adopt. If the preceding observations are well founded, we shall be enabled to distinguish the principal forms or varieties of insanity under the following terms. First, moral insanity, or madness consisting in a morbid perversion of the natural feelings, affections, inclinations, temper, habits, moral dispositions, natural impulses, without any remarkable disorder or defect of the intellect or knowing and reasoning faculties, and particularly without any insane illusion or hallucination. The three following modifications of the disease might be termed intellectual insanity in contradistinction to the preceding form. They are severely 2. Monomania or partial insanity, in which the understanding is partially disordered on or under the influence of some particular illusion, referring to one subject and involving one train of ideas, while the intellectual powers appear, when exercised on other subjects, to be in a great measure unimpaired. 3. Mania, or raving madness, in which the understanding is generally deranged. The reasoning faculty, if not lost, is confused and disturbed in its exercise. The mind is in a state of morbid excitement, and the individual talks absurdly on every subject to which his thoughts are momentarily directed. 4. Incoherence or dementia. By some persons it might be thought scarcely correct to term this a form of insanity, as it has been generally considered as a result and sequel of that disease. In some instances, however, mental derangement has nearly this character from the commencement, or at least assumes it at a very early period. I am therefore justified in stating it, after Pinel, to be a fourth and distinct form of madness. It is this characterized by that justly celebrated writer: rapid succession or uninterrupted alternation of insulated ideas and evanescent and unconnected emotions, continually repeated acts of extravagance, complete forgetfulness of every previous state, diminished sensibility to external impressions, abolition of the faculty of judgment, perpetual activity. If I am correct in assuming that all the varieties of madness might find their place under one of the descriptions thus marked out, a short nosography of the disease, which will answer many of the purposes of a definition, will be furnished by summing up the characteristics of the different forms. We might then describe insanity as a chronic disease manifested by deviations from the healthy and natural state of the mind, such deviations consisting either in a moral perversion or a disorder of the feelings, affections, and habits of the individual, or in intellectual derangement, which last is sometimes partial, namely in monomania, affecting the understanding only in particular trains of thought, or general, and accompanied with excitement, namely in mania or raving madness, or lastly confounding or destroying the connections or associations of ideas and producing a state of incoherence. I shall now endeavor to draw an accurate and tolerably complete description of the phenomenon of insanity, containing a statement generalized from a multitude of particular examples. In this description, while I avail myself of the aid afforded by the best practical writers of different countries, it will be my aim to avoid the admission of any circumstance or feature of disease which I have not in more or fewer instances actually observed. The reader will find, if I am not mistaken in the evidence of facts which I shall lay before him, enough to confirm and illustrate the preceding remarks and to shew how far the distinctions laid down are sufficient and complete. Notes on preceding chapter. The division the division of the forms of insanity pointed out in the preceding chapter is the most simple that is admissible or adapted to the existing varieties of the disease. It is entirely practical and founded on observation. A more extensive arrangement has been laid down by Professor Heinroth in his celebrated treatise on the arrangement of the mental faculties, a work which, though singular and absurd in some of its fundamental principles, is perhaps of all treatises on disorders of the mind the most elaborate and comprehensive. Heinroth's distribution is rather theoretical or speculative than the result of actual observation and experience, yet it will be found worthy of consideration. The disorders of the mind, according to this writer, are only limited in number and in kind by the diversities which exist in the operations of the mental faculties. The mental operations are of three distinct kinds and are referred on the testimony of consciousness to three different departments in our inward nature, to those of the feeling or sentiment, des gemüts, the understanding and the will, the emotions of joy, grief, pleasure, and pain, the mental processes of reflection and contemplation, and the voluntary act of self determination are three kinds of mental phenomena which, as they present themselves to our inward consciousness, are so clearly and strongly distinguished from each other that it is impossible to confound them. If the cause of derangement is in relation to one of these manifestations of mental existence, and to one or another it must belong, since the mind is ever occupied with phenomena related to one out of the three classes. We have only to inquire to which modification the disorder actually refers itself, or whether it affects the feelings, the understanding, or the will. Since one of these has possession of our consciousness, or is at least predominant at every point of time, whichever function of the mind happens to be that which is falling into disorder, by it the form of insanity is determined. Thus, we have, continues Heinroth, three classes of mental diseases corresponding to the three departments of our minds. A second distinction is founded on the character of the disturbance which is experienced, whether it is of the nature of exaltation or depression, of increased or diminished excitement. It would be superfluous to follow Herr Heinroth closely through the particulars with which he has filled up the preceding outline. It appears indeed to me that he has inadvertently lost sight of his original principle of discrimination, and has confounded and sensually separate forms of mental disorder for which he had provided distinct places in his system. I shall simply enumerate the principal modifications of derangement of the mind, or of its diseases and defects, according to the principles of Heinroth's method. First kind of mental disorder: disorders of the moral dispositions. The first division consists, as above stated, in disorders of passion, feeling, or affection of the gemute or moral disposition. This has two forms. First form: exaltation or excessive intensity, undue vehemence of feeling, morbid violence of passions and emotions. Second form: depression, simple melancholy, dejection without illusion of the understanding. Second kind of mental disorders. The second division consists of disorders affecting the understanding or the intellectual faculties. First form: exaltation, undue intensity of the imagination, producing mental illusions. To this head belong all the varieties of monomania. Second form: depression, feebleness of conception of ideas, imbecility of the understanding. Third kind of mental disorders. The third division comprises disorders of the voluntary powers or of propensities and of will. First form: exaltation, violence of will and of propensities, Tolhate or madness without lesion of the understanding. Second form: depression, weakness or incapacity of willing, moral imbecility. To these unmixed forms, others are added under each division, displaying combinations of several simple varieties. Thus, exaltation of feeling with an exalted state of the imagination constitutes derangement of the understanding with violent excitement or raving madness. Delusion with depression of feeling or melancholy constitutes insanity with sorrowful dejection. In one of these divisions, every variety of mental disorder finds its appropriate place. No systematic arrangement of mental disorders can be contrived more complete than that of Professor Heinroth, although founded on abstract views rather than on observation. It might furnish some useful suggestions. Instances of mental derangement really exist of which the characteristic is a morbid state of the feelings and affections, nor is there any certainty as to the existence of disorders which refer themselves to Heinroth's third division. In this, the voluntary powers and propensities are the department of our mental constitution which betrays the symptoms of a disordered state. Propensities, however, are so nearly allied to passions and emotions that they are generally referred to the same division of the faculties or of mental phenomena. Both are included by metaphysicians in the ethical moral department of the mind as contradistinguished from the intellectual. A multiplicity of subdivisions is inconvenient and burdensome, and it appears on the whole better to adhere in describing mental disorders to the more simple classification adopted in the preceding section. In this, the disorders of affection or feeling, as well as those of the active powers or propensities, are comprehended under one head, to which the designation of moral insanity is given. If it were desirable to affix a single compound epithet to this class of mental disorders, the most appropriate would be parapatia, or perhaps pathomania, in coincidence with the monomania of M. Esquirol. The subdivisions of this department might comprise all the modifications of disordered feeling or affection which belong to the first division of Heinroth, as well as the disorders of will or propensity which constitute the third department of that writer. The second division, that of disorders of the intellectual faculties, are in the arrangement which I have selected distributed into general and partial, termed mania and monomania, to which incoherency or dementia is added in the third place, and this division is more in accordance with actual phenomena than that of exaltation in depression adopted by Heinrod. On the whole, I do not discover any reason for changing the distribution already selected, and which in fact I had adopted before the work of Professor Heinrod came into my hands. His scheme is, however, the most complete system that can be formed, and I have laid the outline of it before my readers, as it might tend to render more distinct their conception of the relations of the different forms of insanity to each other. Chapter 2. Phenomena of the insanity described as they are manifested in the different forms of the disease. Section 1. Moral insanity. This form of mental derangement has been described as consisting in a morbid perversion of the feelings, affections, and active powers, without any illusion or erroneous conviction impressed upon the understanding. It sometimes coexists with an apparently unimpaired state of the intellectual faculties. There are many individuals living at large and not entirely separated from society who are affected in a certain degree with this modification of insanity. They are reputed persons of a singular, wayward, and eccentric character. An attentive observer will often recognize something remarkable in their manners and habits, which might lead him to and entertain doubts as to their entire sanity, and circumstances are sometimes discovered on inquiry which add strength to his suspicion. In many instances, it has been found that an hereditary tendency to madness, hereditary burden, has existed in the family, or that several relatives of the person affected have labored under other diseases of the brain. The individual himself has been discovered to have suffered in a former period of life an attack of madness of a decided character. His temper and dispositions are found to have undergone a change, to be not what they were previously to a certain time. He has become an altered man, and the difference has perhaps been noted from the period when he sustained some reverse of fortune, which deeply affected him, or the loss of some beloved relative. In other instances, an alteration in the character of the individual has ensued immediately on some severe shock which his bodily constitution has undergone. This has been either a disorder affecting the head, a slight attack of paralysis, a fit of epilepsy, or some febrile or inflammatory disorder which has produced a perceptible change in the habitual state of the constitution. In some cases, the alteration in temper and habits has been gradual and imperceptible, and it seems only to have consisted in an exaltation and increase of peculiarities which were always more or less natural and habitual. In a state like that above described, many persons have continued for years to be the sources of apprehension and solicitude to their friends and relatives. The latter, in many instances, cannot bring themselves to admit the real nature of the case. The individual follows the bent of his inclinations. He is continually engaging in new pursuits and soon relinquishing them without any other inducement than mere caprice and fickleness. At length, the total perversion of his affections, the dislike, and perhaps even enmity manifested towards his dearest friends, excite greater alarm. When it happens that the head of a family labors under this ambiguous modification of insanity, it is sometimes thought necessary, from prudential motives, and to prevent absolute ruin from thoughtless and absurd extravagance or from the results of wild projects and speculations in the pursuit of which the individual has always a plausible reason to offer for his conduct, to make so attempt with a view to take the management of his affairs out of his hands. The laws have made inadequate provision for such contingencies, and the endeavor is often unsuccessful. If the matter is brought before a jury and the individual gives pertinent replies to the questions that are put to him and displays no particular mental illusion, a feature which is commonly looked upon as essential to madness, it is most probable that the suit will be rejected. Persons laboring under this disorder are capable of reasoning or supporting an argument upon any subject within their sphere of knowledge that might be presented to them, and they often display great ingenuity in giving reasons for the eccentricities of their conduct, and in accounting for and justifying the state of moral feeling under which they appear to exist. In one sense, indeed, their intellectual faculties might be termed unsound. They think and act under the influence of strongly excited feelings, and persons accounted sane are under such circumstances proverbially liable to error, both in judgment and conduct. I have already had occasion to observe that the existence of moral insanity as a distinct form of derangement has been recognized by Pinel. The following example, recorded by that writer, is a characteristic one. Pinel terms this affection emportement manique sans délire. An only son of a weak and indulgent mother gave himself up habitually to the gratification of every caprice and passion of which an untutored and violent temper was susceptible. The impetuosity of his disposition increased with his years. The money with which he was lavishly supplied removed every obstacle to the indulgence of his wild desires. Every instance of opposition or resistance roused him to acts of fury. He assaulted his adversary with the audacity of a savage, sought to reign by force, and was perpetually embroiled in disputes and quarrels. If a dog, a horse, or any other animal offended him, he instantly put it to death. If ever he went to a fete or any other public meeting, he was sure to excite such tumults and quarrels as terminated in actual pugilistic rencontres, and he generally left the skin with a bloody nose. This wayward youth, however, when unmoved by passion, possessed a perfectly sound judgment. When he became of age, he succeeded to the possession of an extensive domain. He proved himself fully competent to the management of his estate, as well as the discharge of his relative duties, and he ever distinguished himself by acts of beneficence and compassion. Wounds, lawsuits, and pecuniary compensations were generally the consequences of his unhappy propensity to quarrel, but an act of notoriety put an end to his career of violence. Enraged with a woman who had used offensive language to him, he threw her into a well. Prosecution was commenced against him, and on the deposition of a great many witnesses who gave evidence of his furious deportment, he was condemned to perpetual confinement in Bicêtre. Several other practical writers have given a testimony which is sufficiently conclusive as to the existence of moral insanity, though they have not designedly and in set terms marked it as a distinct form of mental derangement. The following remarks by Esquirol, expressed as they appear to have been without the design of supporting any system or theory, prove that the writer was led by his ample experience to adopt an opinion similar to that of Pinel. He regards at least the perverted state of moral feelings as not less essential of insanity than that of the intellectual faculties, and even as furnishing in some instances the whole manifestation of the disorder. The insane conceive an aversion for those persons who are most dear to them, revile them, ill treat them, anxiously shun them in consequence of their mistrust, their suspicions, and their fears. Prejudiced against everything, they are afraid of everything. A few appear to form an exception to this general rule in preserving a sort of affection for their relatives and friends, but this feeling of attachment, which is sometimes excessive, subsists without confidence in those persons who before the attack of disease had been the directors of the thoughts and actions of the patient. A melancholic who is devotedly attached to his wife is deaf to her counsels and advice. A son would sacrifice his life for his father, but will not make the slightest attempt in compliance with the entreaties of the latter to overcome the morbid impression which occasions him so much grief. This moral alienation is so constant, says Esquirol, that it appears to me to be the proper characteristic of mental derangement. They are madmen in whom it is difficult to discover any trace of hallucination, but they are none in whom the passions and moral affections are not disordered, perverted, or destroyed. I have in this particular met with no exceptions. A return to the proper and natural state of the moral affections, says the same writer, the desire of seeing once more children or friends, the tears of sensibility, the wish manifested by the individual to open his heart and return into the bosom of his family to resume his former habits, afford certain indication of cure, while the contrary dispositions had been a mark of approaching insanity or the symptom of a threatened relapse. This is not the case when there is merely a disappearance of the hallucination, which then only is a certain sign of convalescence, when the patients return to their natural and original affections. I shall have occasion in the sequel to cite the opinion of this excellent observer, expressed in still stronger terms as to the existence of a form of mental derangement which comes under the definition of moral insanity. M. Georgette has described a morbid state of the feelings and active principles of the mind, or of the propensities and habits, as a particular modification of madness. He observes that individuals predisposed to mental disease by a faulty education or by previous attacks have often continued for a long time, or perhaps even during their whole lives, to attract observation by caprices in their deportment, by something eccentric in their manner and habits of life, by an ill regulated fondness for pursuits of the fancy and the mere productions of the imagination, combined with a striking inaptitude in the study of the exact sciences. The last mentioned particular will scarcely be sufficient to excite a suspicion of madness in this country, whatever might be the case in France. These persons are noted, continues the same writer, for singularity of opinions, of conduct, for transitory fits of intelligence, or sallies of wit, which are too strongly contrasted with their habitual state of nullity or monotony, for a levity in thoughts, a weakness in judgment, a want of connection, connection in their attempts at reasoning. Some individuals are presumptuous, desirous of undertaking everything, and capable of applying themselves to nothing. Others are extravagant and mobile in the utmost degree in their opinions and sentiments. Many are susceptible, irritable, choleric, and passionate. Some are governed by pride and haughtiness without bound. A few are subject to vague anxieties or to panic terrors. It must be remarked that although M. Georgette has described this state of disease as a first stage, or as what he terms with M. Esquirot, the incubation of madness. Yet he says that it often lasts through the life of the individual. We may consider his testimony as given in point of fact in favor of the real existence of the disorder here described as a particular modification of insanity. There are indeed numerous instances in which phenomena similar to this of the previous stage last for many years, perhaps to the end of life, sometimes maintaining their ambiguous and undefined character, in others becoming aggravated in degree, but without undergoing a transition into that form of madness which is attended with illusions and strongly marked disturbances of the intellectual faculties. The term which I have adopted as designating this disease must not be limited in its use to cases which are characterized merely by preternatural excitement of the temper and spirits. There are many other disordered states of the mind which come under the same general division. In fact, the varieties of moral insanity are perhaps as numerous as the modifications of feeling or passion in the human mind. The most frequent forms, however, of the disease are those which are characterized either by the kind of excitement already described or by the opposite state of melancholy dejection. One of these is in many instances a permanent state, but there are cases in which they are alternate or supersede each other, one morbid condition often lasting for a time and giving way without any perceptible cause to an opposite state of the temper and feelings. The prevalent character of the disorder is sometimes derived from the constitutional disposition of the individual, but there are instances in which it is strikingly different from his natural tem- temperament. Lively and cheerful persons become dejected and melancholic, while the gloomy and taciturn change their disposition for one that is sanguine and excitable. A considerable proportion among the most striking instances of moral insanity are those in which a tendency to gloom or sorrow is the predominant feature. When this habitude of mind is natural to the individual and comparatively slight, it does not constitute madness, and it is perhaps impossible to determine the line which marks a transition from predisposition to disease. But there is a degree of disaffection which certainly constitutes disease of mind, and this disease exists without any illusion impressed upon the understanding. The faculty of reason is not manifestly impaired, but a constant feeling of gloom and sadness clouds out the prospects of life. The individual, thus surrounded with all the comforts of existence and even exclusively of his disease, suffering under no internal source of disquiet, at peace with himself, with his own conscience with his God, yet becomes sorrowful and desponding. All things present and future are to his view involved in dreary and hopeless gloom. This tendency to morbid sorrow and melancholy, as it does not destroy the understanding, is often subject to control when it first arises and probably receives a peculiar character from the previous mental state of the individual, from his education and his religious or irreligious character. Persons of well regulated minds, when thus affected, express grief and distress at the inaptitude of which they are conscious to go through the active duties of life. Frequently, they feel a horror of being driven to commit an act of suicide or some other dreadful crime. This idea haunts them and renders them fearful of being a moment alone. It, however, subsides, and such cases often terminate in recovery. Persons of an opposite character give themselves up to tedium vitae, to morose disgust. They loathe their very existence and at length, unless prevented, put an end to it. A state of gloom and melancholy depression occasionally gives way after an uncertain period to an opposite condition of preternatural excitement. In other cases, this last is the primary character of the disease. Individuals thus affected are always in high spirits, active and boisterous, full of projects and enterprises. Such a habit of mind within a certain degree is natural to many persons, but in these instances which form cases of moral insanity, it is beyond the limit that belongs to natural variety of character and has besides peculiar features. In some cases, it appears in persons whose temperament is the very reverse of the state described, and in such examples, it is so much the more striking. In this form of moral derangement, the disordered condition of the mind displays itself in a want of self government, in continual excitement, an unusual expression of strong feelings, in thoughtless and extravagant conduct. A female modest and circumspect becomes violent and abrupt in her manners, loquacious, impetuous, talks loudly and abusively against her relations and guardians before perfect strangers. Sometimes she uses indecent expressions and betrays without reserve unbecoming feelings and trains of thought. Not infrequently, persons affected with this form of disease become drunkards. They have an uncontrollable desire for intoxicating liquors, and a debauch is followed by a period of raving madness, during which it becomes absolutely necessary to keep them in confinement. Individuals are occasionally seen in lunatic asylums, who under such circumstances have been placed under control. After the raving fit has passed off, they demand their release, and when they obtain it, at the first opportunity resort to their former excesses, though perfectly aware of the consequences which await them. In examples of a different description, the mental excitement which constitutes this disease is connected with religious feelings, and this is often the case when the period of excitement has been preceded by one of melancholy, during which the individual affected has labored under depression and gloom, mixed with apprehensions as to his religious state. A person who has long suffered under a sense of condemnation and abandonment, when all the springs of hope and comfort have appeared to be dried up, and nothing has been for a long time felt to mitigate the gloom and sorrow of the present time in the dark and fearful anticipations of futurity, has passed all at once from one extreme to another. His feelings have become of a sudden entirely changed. He has a sense of lively joy in contemplating the designs of Providence towards him, amounting sometimes to rapture and ecstasy. Such a change has been hailed by the relatives of the individual thus affected when they have happened to be pious and devout persons, as a happy transition from a state of religious destitution to one of acceptance and mental peace. But the strain of excitement is too high, the expressions of happiness too ecstatic to be long mistaken. Signs of pride and haughtiness are betrayed, and of a violent and boisterous deportment, which are quite unlike the effects of a religious influence, and soon unfold the real nature of the case. Or it is clearly displayed by the selfishness, the want of natural affection, the variableness of spirits, the irregular mental habits of the individual. In the cases to which I have now referred, there has been no erroneous fact impressed upon the understanding, no illusion or belief of a particular message or sentence of condemnation or acceptance specifically revealed. A disorder so characterized would not fall under the head of moral insanity. The morbid phenomena in the cases of disease which I am now attempting to describe extend only to the state of the feelings and spirits, the temper, the preternaturally excited sentiments of hope and fear, and the results which these influences are calculated to produce in the mental constitution, besides the more usual aspects of moral insanity which refer themselves to morbid depression and excitement. Particular cases are marked by the prevalence of certain passions and mental habits, when displayed under modifications of which the human mind in a sane state appears scarcely to be susceptible. One of the most striking of these forms is distinguished by an unusual prevalence of angry and malicious feelings, which arise without provocation or any of the ordinary incitements. All the examples of madness without delirium reported by Pinel belong to this class of disorders. On this account, the cases described by Pinel failed for a long time to produce conviction on my mind as to the existence of what he terms manie sans délire, or folie raisonnante. I am now persuaded that he was correct in his opinion, and I have ever been led to generalize his statement. Esquirol has assured me that his impression on this subject was similar. He considered Pinel's cases as inconclusive and for a time was disposed to entertain strong doubts as to the existence of insanity without intellectual error or delusion. Esquirol has expressed his conviction of the reality of this form of mental derangement. Medical writers, as well as other reporters, have generally endeavored to reconcile this phenomena with the established opinion respecting the nature of insanity, by assuming on conjecture the existence of some undetected illusion. These conjectures have their foundation in attachment to system. They are not supported by facts. There are instances of insanity in which the whole disease, or at least the whole of its manifestations, has consist, consisted in a liability to violent fits of anger breaking out without cause, and, and leading to the danger or actual commission of serious injury to surrounding persons. The characteristic feature of this melody is extreme irascibility depending on a physical morbid cause. There are other instances in which malignity has a deeper dye. The individual, as if actually possessed by the demon or evil, is continually indulging enmity and plotting mischief, and even murder against some unfortunate object of his malice. When this is connected with the false belief of some personal injury actually sustained, the case does not fall under the head of moral insanity. It involves hallucination or erroneous conviction of the understanding. But when the morbid phenomena include merely the expressions of intense malevolence, without ground or provocation, actual or supposed, the case is strictly one of the nature above described. In many instances, the impulses or propensities to which the individual is subject, rather than his feelings or habitual temper and disposition, give the principal or the sole manifestations of insanity. This is the form of madness to which, when accompanied with excitement, Reuel, Hofbauer, and other German writers, who, however, have written since the observation of Pinel, have termed Rentauchheit. Many instances are well known in which a sudden impulse to commit some atrocious act has arisen in the mind of a person otherwise apparently sane and certainly in full possession of his intellectual powers. This impulse has often been resisted by reason and voluntary effort. It has been confessed with grief and alarm to physicians or other persons who have been entreated to adopt precautions of safety in order to prevent some lamentable catastrophe. In other cases, crimes have been perpetrated without any fixed object or motive, and the punishment of the law has fallen upon the unfortunate victim of disease. Some insane persons display their condition by a propensity to commit every species of mischief, thus devoid of any feeling of malevolence. A case of this description, strongly marked, was lately pointed out to me in the work Lunatic Asylum by Dr. Wake, the able and intelligent physician to that institution. The individual is a youth of good temper, cheerful and active, having no defect of understanding that could be discovered even after long observation. He is continually prone to commit every kind of mischief in his power, and not long ago escaped from his confinement and made his way to Bishop Trop, Bishop Thorpe Palace with the design to set it on fire. Dr. Wake has assured me that several cases have occurred precisely similar to that above related in our essential symptoms during his superintendence of York Asylum, which has continued 18 years. A propensity to theft is often a feature of moral insanity, and sometimes it is its leading, if not the sole characteristic. I hope lately seen a lunatic confined in an asylum who would only eat when he had stolen food, and his keeper made it a constant practice to put into some corner within his reach various articles destined for his sustenance, in order that he might discover and take them furtively. Many instances are upon record of individuals noted for a propensity to steal without the desire of subsequent possession. Thus, in other respects of sound mind, or at least not generally looked upon as deranged. Probably some of these would afford, if accurately scrutinized, examples of moral insanity, while others might be found referable to eccentricity of character. The discrimination, if indeed the two things are essentially different, could only be made in particular instances by taking into the account a variety of circumstances, such as the hereditary history of the individual and his consanguinity, consanguinity with persons decidedly insane, his former character and habits, and the inquiry whether he has undergone a change in these respects at some particular period of his life. Eccentricity of conduct, singular and absurd habits, a propensity to perform the common actions of life in a different way from that usually practiced, is a feature in many cases of moral insanity, but can hardly be said to constitute sufficient evidence of its existence. Dr. Joseph Frank saw at Bedlam a child 10 years of age who was constantly under the influence of an irresistible impulse to break and destroy everything that came in his way. This child appeared in other respects as reasonable as one could desire. He even seldom failed to demand, of his own accord, the punishment allotted to the mischief which he had committed. M. Guislain, Traité sur aliénation.
How can I?
M. Guislain in Traité sur aliénation. Some other cases of moral insanity occurring in children will be mentioned in the sequel. Eccentricity of conduct, singular and absurd habits, a propensity to perform the common actions of life in a different way from that usually practiced, is a feature in many cases of moral insanity, but can hardly be said to constitute sufficient evidence of its existence. When, however, such phenomena are observed in connexion with a wayward and intractable temper, with a decay of social affections, an aversion to the nearest relatives and friends formerly beloved, in short, with a change in the moral character of the individual, the case becomes tolerably well marked. With some of the traits above described, it happens not unfrequently that extreme penury is combined and the aggregate of peculiarities makes up a character which is generally the laughing stock of the neighborhood or of the whole circle of acquaintance by which the individual is surrounded. A variety of instances are mentioned by systematical writers in which the unusual intensity of particular passions or emotions has been thought to constitute mental disease, and a series of compound epithets has been invented for the purpose of affording names to such states of the mind and its affections. Nostalgia and erotomania have been considered as disorders of sentiment, satyriasis and nymphomania of the physical feelings. The excessive intensity of any passion is disorder in a moral sense. It might depend physically on certain states of the constitution, but this does not so clearly constitute madness as the irregular and perverted manifestation of desires and aversions. There is reason to believe that this species of insanity has been the real source of moral phenomena of an anomalous and unusual kind, and of certain perversions of natural inclination which excite the greatest disgust and abhorrence. Facts have occurred within my knowledge which afford proof and illustration of this remark. A young man, previously of most respectable character, became subject to severe epileptic fits, which were the prelude to attacks of violent mania, lasting as it generally happens in this form of the disease but a few days and recurring at uncertain intervals. These complaints, after a time, disappeared in a great measure, but they left the individual excessively irritable in temper, irascible, and impetuous, liable to sudden bursts of anger or rage, during which he became dangerous to persons who were near to him. Of symptoms of this description, a state approximating to the satyriasis of medical writers is no unusual accompaniment, but in the present instance, the diseased propensities of the individual were displayed in such a manner as to render confinement in a lunatic asylum the only preservative against criminal accusations. A form of mental derangement has been described by some writers which is peculiar to old age. It is not of frequent occurrence, but certainly exists as a particular modification of madness. It has been termed delirium senile, but more properly by Dr. Burroughs, who had accurately distinguished senile insanity. It constitutes a variety of moral insanity. This disordered state makes its appearance in old men who have never before been insane or suspected of any tendency to mental derangement. It consists, like other forms of moral insanity, in a morbid excitement of passions and a remarkable perversion of the temper and propensities. The whole moral character of the person is changed. The pious, says Dr. Burroughs, become impious. The content and happy discontented and miserable, the prudent and economical imprudent and ridiculously profuse, the liberal penurious, the sober drunken. In some elderly persons, impulses which had long been effete become of a sudden excited, and a strong tendency to vicious habits is displayed. In fact, the reverence which age and the conduct suited to it always command is converted into shame and pity at the perversion of these moral and social qualities which perhaps have hitherto adorned the patient's declining days. This description coincides accurately with the character of moral insanity. There are instances, though rare, of the appearance of hallucinative madness in old persons, but the case we have now described is of a different character and consists in a disordered condition of the moral or active powers alone. The prognosis in cases of moral insanity is often more unfavorable than in other forms of mental derangement. When the disorder is connected with a strong natural predisposition, it can scarcely be expected to terminate in recovery. Such, we must conclude, to be the case in those instances in which the phenomena bear the appearance of an increase or exaltation of peculiar of peculiarities natural to the individual and noted as remarkable traits in his previous habits. When likewise this disease has supervened on some physical change in the constitution, it is likely to be permanent unless the circumstances under which it arose can be reversed, and for bringing about such a salutary result, we have too often to regret that the art of medicine affords very inadequate resources. If, however, this morbid state of the mind has been the effect of any external and accidental cause which admits of removal, or if the individual can be abstracted from its influence or defended against it, there is reason to hope that the disorder might gradually subside. Such recoveries have in fact taken place within the sphere of my own personal observation, but unless the desired change has been made at an early period, the disease is likely either to be permanent or to terminate in another form of insanity. Section 2 of Monomania, or partial derangement of the understanding. This form of insanity is characterized by some particular illusion or erroneous conviction impressed upon the understanding and giving rise to a partial aberration of judgment. The individual affected is rendered incapable of thinking correctly on subjects connected with the particular illusion, while in other respects he betrays no palpable disorder of mind. Melancholia is the term by which this species of insanity was distinguished by medical writers from the age of Hippocrates until within a few years. This expression, as it was well observed by M. Esquirol, suggested the idea, not always consistent with facts, that partial derangement of the understanding is essentially of a gloomy character or connected with sadness and despondency. The illusions which possess the mind are not constantly in individuals partially insane, indicative of grief or melancholy. Some patients of this description are proud and elated and fancy themselves kings or emperors, but on ordinary subjects are capable of talking coherently, if not rationally. They appear to be happy in their delusions. Others are insane upon some metaphysical or abstract notion, on which they talk absurdly but without any predisposition to grief or mental dejection. Melancholia seemed to be an improper designation for cases of this kind, and the term monomania, which was happily suggested by M. Esquirol, has been universally adopted in its place. The meaning attached by former writers to melancholia was, however, precisely the same as that which is now expressed by monomania. It is thus laid down in the most explicit terms by Van Swieten. Amania distinguitur melancholia quod nondum adsit sevus ille furor, qui in maniacis observatur. Praeterea et illud signum diagnosticum melancholiae est, quod uni et eidem cogitationi pertinacissime inherant tales egri, et fere circa hans illamve opinionem delirant tantum, in reliquis omnibus sanam ostendunt mentem et saepe acutissimum ingenium. The notion, however, which many persons entertain as to the nature of this disease is far from being correct in its full extent. It is supposed that the mind of the monomaniac is perfectly sound when its faculties are exercised on any subject unconnected with a particular impression, which in itself constitutes the entire disease. Cases are indeed on record which, if faithfully related, fully come up to this description, In general, the real character of monomania is very different. Addition, the term melancholia has, however, only become improper in modern times. For anciently, this word, in ordinary language at least, conveyed no idea of gloom or dejection. Melancholia meant simply to be mad, or to be out of one's mind. In that sense, exactly the word is often used by Aristophanes without any reference to lowness of spirits. A distinction, however, was made by medical writers, though it was by no means constantly observed. Hippocrates, speaking of the case of Timocrates, from Greek, being driven mad by black bile, he drank the drug or potion. Here, mania includes melancholy as a particular variety, and the Latin sentence I had read minutes ago means on Latin, melancholia is distinguished from mania in that the savage fury which is observed in maniacs is not yet present. Furthermore, a diagnostic sign of melancholy is that such sufferers adhere very obstinately to one and the same thought and generally only rave about one or another opinion. In all other respects, they show a sound mind and often a very sharp wit. It is supposed that the mind of the monomaniac is perfectly sound when its faculties are exercised on any subject unconnected with a particular impression, which in itself constitutes the entire disease. Cases are indeed on record which, if faithfully related, fully come up to this description. In general, the real character of monomania is very different. The individual affected is under ordinary circumstances calm and exhibits no symptom of that perturbation and constant excitement which are observed in raving madness. But on careful inquiry, it will be found that his mind is in many respects in a different condition from that of perfect health. The habits and disposition have perhaps been long in a greater or a less degree in the state which characterizes moral insanity. If we advert to the order and connection of morbid phenomena, we often learn that on a settled and habitual melancholy, or on a morose and sullen misanthropy, long growing and indulged, or on some other disordered and perverted state of the feelings and affections, a particular illusion has more recently supervened. An individual of melancholic temperament, who has long been under the influence of circumstances calculated to impair his health and call into play the morbid tendencies of his constitution, sustains some unexpected misfortune or is subjected to causes of anxiety. He becomes dejected in spirits, desponds, broods over his feelings, till all the prospects of life appear to him dark and comfortless. His inclinations are now so altered that no motive has sufficient influence over him to rouse him to voluntary and cheerful exertion. During this period, if questioned as to the causes of his mental dejection, he will probably assign no particular reason for it. At length, his gloom and despondency becoming more and more intense, his imagination fixes upon some particular circumstance of a distressing nature, and this becomes, after a yard, the focus round which the feelings which harass him concentrate themselves. These circumstances, often some real, occasionally some trifling act of delinquency, for which the individual expresses the strongest and perhaps disproportionate self condemnation. In other instances, an unreal phantom suggests itself in harmony with the prevalent tone of the feelings, which at first haunts the mind as possible, and is at length admitted as a reality. Other individuals begin by indulging morose and unfriendly sentiments towards all their acquaintance, magnifying in imagination every trifling neglect into a grievous contumely. They fancy at length that they find in some casual occurrence glaring proofs of premeditated designs to ruin them and expose them to the contempt and derision of society. The disease in these cases has its real commencement long before the period when the particular illusion, which is only an accessory symptom, is discovered, and even before it became impressed on the imagination. But it is not until that impression has taken place that the case assumes the proper character of monomania. The illusion which torments the monomaniac is generally something bearing a near relation to his former habits of business, or the usual occupation of his thoughts. I was consulted some years ago on the case of a youth who had become insane, as his friends supposed, through unusual excitement and exertion of mind. He had been attending the sermons of a preacher noted for the vehemence of his language, and at the same time had devoted himself to studies for which he was unprepared, to the neglect of sleep and bodily exercise. He became depressed in spirits and disordered both in body and mind. The morbid feelings which afflicted him at length conjured up for themselves an imaginary cause which soon became indelibly impressed upon his belief. He fancied himself to be suspected of some horrible crime for which a process had commenced against him, and whenever the door of his room was opened, he supposed that officers of justice were coming to apprehend him. This youth was the son of an attorney in a county town who was frequently employed in criminal prosecutions. That the order and succession of morbid phenomena in the development of this disease is really such as I have described it to be, I shall prove in the following section by the statement of some cases in which the actual supervention of erroneous belief or illusion on a previously existing moral insanity was clearly marked and admitted of no doubt. Medical writers have distributed the forms of monomania into many classes or divisions. The subdivision would be endless if we were to constitute as many different kinds as there are modes and varieties of hallucination. But the most proper and useful distribution is founded on the prevailing passions or feelings which give origin and impart the peculiar character to the disease. Mental dejection or melancholy which extinguishes hope and gives the mind up to fear and the anticipation of evils lays the foundation for many kinds of varieties of monomania. The most numerous and the worst instances are those in which the thoughts are directed towards the evils of a future life. The unseen state opens the most ample scope to the dark and gloomy anticipations of melancholy and remorse, and hence it is selected by the desponding monomaniac as a field for the exercise of his self-torturing imagination. If the habits of his mind lead him to fix by preference on scenes connected with the present life, he still finds imaginary objects of terror and disquietude. 2 centuries ago, persons were everywhere to be found who fancied themselves possessed by demons, just as the ancients were pursued and agitated by the Furies. The monomania occupies an important place among the forms of insanity described by the old writers, and we are informed by Jacobi that this is still the character which in some Catholic countries insanity connected with superstition frequently assumes. In modern times, says Esquirol, the punishments which the priest denounces have ceased to influence the minds and conduct of men, and governments have recourse to restraints of a different kind. Many lunatics express now as much dread of the tribunals of justice as they formerly entertained of the influence of stars and demons. C'est toujours là pour l'unanimité, l'inquiétude, la crainte qui agissant sur ces infortunés comme elles éteignent la cause des maladies des possédés. Tel individu est petites maisons persécuées, il craint la police qui eût été brûlé autrefois persécué, il aurait et pur du diable. From French, it is always anxiety, worry, and fear that act upon these misfortunes, just as they were the cause of the illnesses of the possessed. Such an individual is in the petites maisons because he fears the police, just as he would have been burned at the stake in the past for fearing the devil. And in addition, from German, the suffering understood in these mental disorders arises solely as a consequence of mental illness, is sustained by it, and is not only connected to it, but is also alleviated by influences directed at the mind. The melancholic is not plunged into his illness by this or that sad idea, but the idea arises because he suffers from such an illness. Likewise, the ludicrous absurdities in which the fool delights do not make him a fool, but he must delight in them because he suffers from an illness that necessitates it. When fear and apprehension subside into a confirmed and settled despondency, as the latter state of feeling is less agitating than the former, the mind displays more the appearance of tranquillity, but it is a deceitful calm, concealing profound grief and misery. Of this description, however, are some of the most remarkable cases of intellect apparently sound in all other respects, but laboring under one delusion, on which, as on certain data, individuals reason correctly and acutely. Such illusions turn always on some circumstance connected with the person of the lunatic, his treatment by his relatives or by society in this world, or his destiny hereafter. Many religious persons, laboring under a predisposition to grief and despondency, have conceived the opinion that they are doomed to future perdition, their own cases forming particular exceptions to the otherwise merciful dispensations of Providence. A singular modification of this result of despondency is related in the striking case of Samuel Brown, who at a time when all the powers of his mind subsisted in a full vigor, conceived that his rational soul had gradually perished under the displeasure of God, and that an animal life merely was left to him in common with the brutes. A great number and variety of cases coming under the same head of monomania associated with fear and despondency are instances in which the apprehensions of the individual are concentrated on his bodily feelings, or relate to some diseased or preternatural state in which he conceives himself to exist. In the first stage, this disease is hypochondriasis, patient dwells constantly on some trifling ailments, which he magnifies in apprehension, broods over, and on account of which he makes himself miserable. In this form, hypochondriasis constitutes a variety of moral insanity, and 100 cases of this description are to be found for one which actually makes the transition into erroneous belief. When this change has taken place, the disorder is accounted a decided one of insanity, as when a man fancies that his head has grown larger than his body, that his legs are made of glass, that he has a wolf or a fish in his stomach. The absurd ideas which the diseased imagination frames in order to account for trifling bodily suffering are as numerous as they are strange and surprising. I well remember a lunatic who labored apparently under neuralgic pains. He fancied that the physician to whose care he was confided had the power of torturing him by electricity, and that invisible wires were spread through every part of the house, as conductors of the fluid which was used at night as the instrument of cruel and tyrannical persecution. Many a flatulent hypochondriac has fancied the existence of a goblin or demon in his stomach, and the association between his internal feelings and the idea by which it was accounted for has become so firm that nothing in future has been capable of changing it. A case exemplifying this remark is related by Dr. Jacobi, which is so curious that I have determined to extract it. A man confined in the lunatic asylum at Würzburg, in other respects rational, of quiet, discreet habits, so that he was employed in the domestic business of the house, labored under the impression that there was a person concealed within his belly, with whom he held frequent conversations. He often perceived the absurdity of this idea, and grieved in acknowledging and reflecting that he was under the influence of so groundless a persuasion, but could never get rid of it. It was very curious to observe, says Jacobi, how, when he had but an instant before cried, "What nonsense! Is it not intolerable to be so deluded? Is it not intolerable to be so deluded?" And while the tears which accompanied these exclamations were yet in his eyes, he again began to talk, apparently with entire conviction, about the whisperings of the person in his belly, who told him that he was to marry a great princess. An attempt was made to cure this man by putting a large blister on his abdomen, and at the instant when it was dressed and the vesiculated skin snipped, throwing from behind him a dressed up figure, as if just extracted from his body. The experiment so far succeeded that the patient believed in the performance, and his joy was at first boundless in the full persuasion that he was cured, but some morbid feeling about the boils, which he had associated with the insane impression still continuing, or being again experienced, he took up the idea that another person similar to the first was still left within him, and under that persuasion he continued to labor. Dejection of spirits combined with malevolent feelings gives rise to misanthropical monomania, which is a very frequent form of the disease. The individual who labors under it is almost as miserable as the melancholic or hypochondriac. He fancies himself to the object of hatred and persecution, of secret machinations, of plots of all descriptions, sees enemies in his dearest friends, suspects poison in his food, and imagines that injuries of every kind are perpetrated or at least designed against him. A case very descriptive of this variety of monomania will be related in the next section, in which its supervention or moral insanity is clearly evident. Excess of self love is an ingredient in every modification of monomania, and when this is combined with an elate and sanguine disposition, instead of depressed spirits and a morose temper, it produces cheerful illusions, which always maintain their relation to the person of the lunatic. A monomaniac fancies himself a king, the pope, a favorite of heaven. This, however, does not constitute a single delusion, leaving the mind perfectly sane in other respects. The same individual magnifies himself in other relations. I saw lately a lunatic at Bicester who fancies himself a monarch. Perceiving me, as I suppose, to be a stranger, he accosted me with the words, Je parle toutes les langues. Je parlais toutes les langues. From French, I speak all languages. Most gay and cheerful monomaniacs display a degree of this insane vanity. A characteristic case of the same kind was given by Bonetus, which Dr. Arnold has extracted in his work on insanity. I believe that the remarks which I have made on the varieties of partial insanity above mentioned, and the mode of its origin, will be found to apply to every instance of monomania properly so termed. The illusion is always some notion as to the powers, property, dignity, or destination of the individual affected, which is engrafted upon his habitual state of desire or aversion, passion, and feeling. There is another class of illusions which belong not to insanity but to ecstasies. They constitute not a simple erroneous notion impressed on the belief like the hallucinations of the monomaniac, but an entire imaginary scheme displayed to his view like a series of real transactions or a continuous dream. When the individual perseveres their rea- in believing their reality, a species of derangement ensues. But it is so peculiar and so unlike any of the ordinary forms of madness as to require a separate consideration under the head of ecstatic affections, to which I have referred it. Before I proceed to describe the remaining forms of mental derangement, I pur- purpose to lay before my reader the statements of a few selected cases exemplifying the character of moral insanity, as well as that of monomania, and likewise of some which tend to illustrate the connexion between these two forms of disease and the transition from one into the other. Section 3. Cases exemplifying the description of moral insanity and that of monomania, or illustrating the relation between these forms of disease and the transition from one into the other. The first case that I shall relate is one which for some years bore precisely the character attributed to moral insanity. During this period, many of the friends of the individual affected supposed him to be only very eccentric, while some who had opportunities of observing him closely were convinced that he was deranged. His disorder at length broke out in a form which admitted of no doubt, that of monomania, accompanied with great distress of mind, and it terminated in suicide. I give the details of this case as I received them from an intimate friend of the individual affected. Case 1 of someone A.B., a gentleman remarkable for the warmth of his affections and the amiable simplicity of his character, possessed of great intellectual capacity, strong powers of reasoning, and a lively imagination, married a lady of high mental endowments, and who was long well known in the literary world. He was devotedly attached to her, but entertained the greatest jealousy lest the world should suppose that, in consequence of her talents, she exercised an undue influence over his judgment, or dictated his compositions. He accordingly set out, with a determination of never consulting her or yielding to her influence, and was always careful when engaged in writing that she should be ignorant of the subject which occupied his thoughts. His wife has been often heard to lament that want of sympathy and union of mind which are so desirable in married life. This peculiarity, however, in the husband so much increased that in after years the most trifling proposition on her part was canvassed and discussed by every kind of argument. In the meantime, he acquired strange peculiarities of habits. His love of order, or placing things in what he considered order or regularity, was remarkable. He was continually putting chairs, etc., in their places, and if articles of ladies' work or books were left upon a table, he would take an opportunity, unobserved, of putting them in order, generally spreading the work smooth and putting the other articles in rows. He would steal into rooms belonging to other persons for the purpose of arranging the various articles. So much time did he consume in trifles, placing and replacing and running from one room to another, that he was rarely dressed by dinner time and often apologized for dining in his dressing gown when it was well known that he had done nothing the whole morning but dress. And he would often take a walk in a winter's evening with a lanthorn because he had not been able to get ready earlier in the day. He would run up and down the garden a certain number of times, rinsing his mouth with water and spitting alternately on one side and then on the other in irregular succession. He employed a good deal of time in rolling up little pieces of writing paper, which he had used for cleaning his nose. In short, his peculiarities were innumerable, but he concealed them as much as possible from the observation of his wife, whom he knew to be vexed at his habits, and to whom he always behaved with the most respectful and affectionate attention, out of she could not influence him in the slightest degree. He would, however, occasionally break through these habits, as on Sundays, though he rose early for the purpose. He was always ready to perform service at a chapel a mile and a half distant from his house. It was a mystery to his intimate friends when and how he prepared these services. It did not at all surprise those who were best acquainted with his peculiarities to hear that in a short time he became notoriously insane. He fancied his wife's affections were alienated from him, continually affirming that it was quite impossible she could have any regard for a person who had rendered himself so contemptible. He committed several acts of violence, argued vehemently in favor of suicide, and was shortly afterward found drowned in a canal near his house. It must not be omitted that this individual derived a predisposition to madness by hereditary transmission. His father had been insane. Case 2. The second case is one which had likewise, for a considerable period, the character of moral insanity and degenerated into or assumed that of monomania. The details which I relate are such as I collected from the friends of the individual and from his own communications. Someone S.D., a gentleman about 30 years of age, has labored for several years under symptoms of moral insanity. He has been long dejected in spirits and morose in temper, dissatisfied with himself and suspicious of all that surrounded him. He was capricious and unsteady in his pursuits, frequently engaging in some new study in the most sanguine manner, and soon abandoning it in despair of making any progress. Though possessed of good talents and considerable acquirements of knowledge, he passed the requisite period of time at one of the universities, but could not be prevailed upon to go in for his degree, either through timidity and want of resolution, or, as it was conjectured by his friends, from a morbid apprehension that the examiners would not deal fairly with him, and award him the station to which he aspired and believed himself entitled. He applied himself afterward to the study of medicine and then to that of metaphysics, and speedily relinquished both. He frequently changed his residence, but soon began to fancy himself the object of dislike to every person in the house of which he became the inmate. His peculiarities appearing to increase, he was visited by two physicians who were desired to investigate the nature of his case. On being questioned narrowly as to the ground of the persuasion expressed by him that he was disliked by the family with which he then resided, he replied that he heard whispers uttered in distant apartments of the house, indicative of malevolence and abhorrence. An observation was made to him that it was impossible for sounds so uttered to be heard by him. He then asked if the sense of hearing could not, by some physical change in the organ, be occasionally so increased in intensity as to become capable of affording distinct perception at an unusual distance, as the eyes of mariners are well known to be accommodated by a long effort to very distant vision. This was the only instance of what might be termed hallucination discovered in the case after a minute scrutiny. It seemed to be a late suggestion. The individual had been for years laboring under a gradually increasing moral insanity. His judgment had become at length perverted by the intensity of his morbid feelings, and admitted as real an erroneous impression suggested by his fancy, which happened to be in harmony with his feelings and served to account for them. Case 3. This case was strictly one of moral insanity for some years. After its commencement, and it maintained that character throughout its duration, except that at one period, under great excitement, the patient began to display signs of an approach of monomania in the groundless suspicions which she expressed respecting the persons who were about her. These symptoms, however, continued but for a very short time and have never recurred. At the period when this individual came under my observation, her disorder had precisely the character of moral insanity. Someone AF is a maiden lady, aged about 48, of short stature and somewhat deformed. Her natural disposition was steady and industrious. She accomplished her undertakings by dint of application rather than by energetic or sudden effort. She was constant rather than ardent in her attachments, free from resentment, never the subject of lively emotions, a great respecter of truth, just and very exact in all that she said or did. Her charitable acts were commensurate with her means, deliberate and the result of principle, rather than arising from the mere impulse of compassionate feeling. She was cautious and reserved in her communications and scarcely if ever formed any familiar and particular intimacies with young persons of her own sex. Being debarred by her infirmities from associating with the young and active, she seemed more like an adult member of the family than a child. She was very clever in arithmetic and in all matters of business, and was fond of regulating and controlling the little affairs of those who formed the domestic circle surrounding her. Young persons and servants, finding that they derived advantage from her advice, generally gave her an opportunity of gratifying her inclination. Her dress, which was always plain and in good taste, was to her an object of greater attention than it often is to persons of fashion. In March 1822 she was attacked by severe inflammation in the lungs, attended by expectoration of bloody mucus. This was the first time in her life when it was necessary to confine her to bed. She submitted with great reluctance to the restrictions that were needful for her recovery and would not be persuaded until she had heard the opinion of an old friend of her family who is a medical practitioner that the means adopted were proper and required by her case. She was then, however, in a great measure reconciled, and after 7 or 8 weeks was so far recovered as to bear a removal into her native country. At this period, nobody believed that she would survive another winter. Her restoration to her usual state of health was very slow, and her sister, who was her constant companion, perceived with sorrow that her temper was now much changed. She appeared restless, always wishing to go somewhere or to do something to which she was unequal, becoming unjustly irritated when she could not urge her sister, whose health and spirits were declining, to fall in with her ideas and occasionally giving way to reproaches which were keenly felt. She tried every method of persuasion to induce her sister to go to the neighborhood of London. Though for the preservation of her life the latter had been obliged to give up the custom of spending the winter there, and the attempt was considered dangerous to her. Every inducement, every argument was suggested to promote this favorite object. Other towns were too warm and too cold, too hilly, too much intersected with water, too foggy. In 1827 she determined to go without her sister to H, near London. She went, and from her letters her sister perceived that she was living in a state of excitement far surpassing that of her former habits. paying short visits to friends in the surrounding villages, going out in the common short stages, without so much regard to weather as was usual to her even in the summer, receiving small parties at home, attending a very crowded church, writing a great many letters, etc., etc. She used to write to her sister in rather a boastful style, frequently mentioning her good health and high spirits, as if to justify her choice of a residence near the metropolis. When the sisters met during the summer at their house in Shire, her high spirits were gone. She looked more aged than the time elapsed would have led anyone to expect, took less interest in her garden, appeared exhausted, and without contributing her share to the conversation, used frequently to sleep in her chair. She lay much in bed, nursed herself up, and in October went again to H, as much agog as ever. Another winter passed much as the preceding one had done. She spoke much again of her high spirits, visited much, was observed to be unusually liberal in her presents to most of her acquaintances. A second summer of inertness was succeeded by a winter at H. She was now weak, indisposed for visiting, and in fact so much worse as to be unable to follow her inclinations. In the spring of 1830 she had an attack of the same nature as that in 1822, but not so severe or lasting. In the summer she was nearly as before, and quite as eager to resume her plans, as enthusiastic in her commendations of everybody and everything at H. About this time some riots took place in London, and more were apprehended. She now expressed herself as apprehensive that very awful times were at hand, wrote frequent letters to her sister, full of indecision, and expressive of distrust in her servants, her host, and his family. A friend who called upon her was shocked to find her in so low a way. He thought her unfit to be alone, and she was unwilling to adopt any plan for leaving her lodgings or having anyone with her. She said she should be happy with her sister and knew that she should be taken care of by the latter, but dreaded becoming a burden to her and making her ill, yet feared that if she did not go to her sister, someone would put her where no one would know and cause her to sign papers which she ought not to sign. She was evidently apprehensive of being sent to a lunatic asylum. She thought her host was a writer of swing letters and dreaded that he might fill the house with combustibles and blow it up with her in it. It might hereafter require to be explained that, about the period above mentioned, the threatening letters of incendiaries in various parts of the country frequently bore the signature of Swing. A medical man who was taken to see her said that she was in a state of great mental excitement and ought to be taken to her sister as soon as possible. The frost was severe when she was escorted to her sister, who was then settled at Bristol, yet she took no cold, experienced no injury from fatigue, and lost that feeling of terror to which she had for some time been subject. Since she has been with her sister, she has been increasingly obstinate, suspicious, undecided, restless, parsimonious even to meanness. indisposed to any employment, bodily or mental, except as far as relates to a most troublesome interference with the most minute actions of others. Could she have her own way, she would control the food, dress, and employment of everyone near her. She has become negligent in dress and comparatively dirty in her habits, yet has an insatiable desire for new clothes, which she never finds the right time to wear. She is constantly predicting her utter ruin, is sure she will not have money enough to live until such and such a time, knows that enough will not be found to pay Dr. blah blah blah, knows he will not let anyone of so shabby an appearance be long in his house, does not know where she shall go when he is tired of her, thinks that it is the devil that makes her behave as she does, that her heart is hardened to do what she ought not to do. She is like the man spoken of in the Gospel, who could not be bound even with fetters. She sees people look at her, hopes they don't think she drinks too much, is quite sure she never did. These impressions are continually varying, but no sooner is her mind tranquilized on one subject than another source of disquietude arises, so that she exhausts every person who is along with her. Her bodily health is better than it was for years previous to her mental derangement. A constitutional asthma to which she she has been subject from the age of 6 or 7 years has nearly subsided, and the habitual profuse expectoration has considerably diminished. She wears less clothing and appears less sensible to cold or damp than before, than heretofore. I had several interviews with the subject of the foregoing relation, during some of which she gave replies to a variety of questions, referring to the past and actual state of her health, both bodily and mental. No impression could be traced in her mind that bore the character of insane hallucination. The circumstance most observable in her condition was a perpetual disposition to find fault with every action, even the most trivial that was witnessed by her. When asked if she was not aware of this propensity, she seemed to give an unwilling affirmative to the question, and she was plainly aware of the fact, for on the inquiry being made whether the habit had only existed of late years or had been a part of her natural character, she steadily averred that such was not her natural disposition, that she was formerly very different. Case 4. This case is one of the moral insanity with high excitement, which never displayed any of the signs of intellectual madness, and terminated in recovery. Someone, G.H., a farmer, several of whose relatives had been the subjects of mental derangement, was a man of sober and domestic habits, and frugal and steady in his conduct, until about his 45th year, when his disposition appeared to have become suddenly changed in a manner which excited the surprise of his friends and neighbors, and occasioned grief and vexation in his family. He became wild, excitable, thoughtless, full of schemes and absurd projects. He would set out and make long journeys into distant parts of the country to purchase cattle and farming stock, of which he had no means of disposing. He bought a number of carriages, hired an expensive house ready furnished, which had been inhabited by a person much above his rank, and was unsuitable to his condition. The following incident was related as an instance of his capricious conduct. He had expressed a desire to survey an estate belonging to a gentleman in the neighborhood, with a view of becoming his tenant, and had been told that he should be conducted over the ground whenever he chose to call upon the stew yard. The time which he selected for this purpose was the middle of a dark night. The steward was awakened and listened with surprise and suspicion to the proposal. He remonstrated for some time, but finding G.H. determined on his purpose, and pleading a positive promise from the landlord of the estate, he at length acquiesced and accompanied the farmer with a lantern over the fields. G.H. made remarks on the trees, which denoted the quality of the soil, the thickness of the hedges, and the usual signs which distinguish good from sterile land. He had gone over the estate and took his leave just as the morning light began to dawn. G.H. was irascible and impetuous, quarrelled with his neighbors, and committed an assault upon the clergyman of the parish, for which he was indicted and bound to take his trial. At length, his wife became convinced that he was mad, and made application for his confinement in a lunatic asylum, which was consequently effected. The medical practitioners who examined him were convinced of his insanity by comparing his late wild habits and unaccountable conduct with the former tenor of his life, taking into consideration the tendency to the disease which was known to prevail in his family. The change in his character alone had produced a full conviction of his madness in his friends and relatives. When questioned as to the motives which had induced him to some of his late proceedings, he gave clear and distinct replies, and assigned, with great ingenuity, some plausible reason for almost every part of his conduct. After a period of time passed in quiet seclusion, his mind became gradually tranquilized. The morbid excitement of his temper and feelings disappeared. He was set at liberty and has since conducted himself with propriety. A brother of the above patient has been at two different times confined in the same asylum, laboring under symptoms of derangement in all essential particulars resembling this above detailed. His disorder has consisted chiefly in morbid excitement, wildness, wildness and irregularity of conduct, differing from his usual habits and character, without any hallucination or disturbance of the intellectual faculties. He has on both occasions remained in the asylum until he was fully convalescent, and after his departure has acknowledged his conviction that he had been deranged and in a state requiring control and seclusion from society.